For today, we're going to be covering chapter 8, which is fluid level check. So the idea with this chapter is we're looking at everything that has to go through and work with checking the fluid level on a particular vehicle. So with that, we are looking at, we need to make sure that we're checking all the proper fluid levels, getting the right fluid in them, making sure that we're not overfilling it. There's some stuff that we want to have a certain level of fluid on. There's other stuff that we don't, that we want to make sure is not overfilled and it isn't really looked at. So what we're going to look at is we're going to look at a couple different things. So majority of the fluids when we're looking at an automobile, they're going to cool, lubricate, and seal components off. So it's often not really understood, but engine oil and coolant will have properties in them that will allow for them to expand and seal up different sealing surfaces. This is especially the case for older gaskets with cork and fiber. Now, it is important that a driver operator maintains fluid levels throughout the operating use of the vehicle. It is something that can get easily forgotten and isn't always something that they'll maintain. When we're looking at modern vehicles now, a lot of consumers, the customer in that sense, will treat the vehicle as an appliance. They won't necessarily treat it as if they are needing maintenance. So they'll not check the oil level regularly. They'll not check the coolant level. They'll not check power steering, and so on and so forth. And then that will do immediate damage to different components. So that's why this is going to be extremely important to keep track of. So when we're looking at actually checking the fluid levels, we got to gain access to the vehicle. So all vehicles will have some sort of hood release. Now, the hood release isn't always in the same place. For the most part, it's going to be below what's commonly referred to as the knee bolster. So if you're sitting in the driver's seat on left-hand drive vehicles, it's going to be right below where the steering column stock is and everything. It'll be found down there somewhere, and it'll be a pull release, and that will be the release to pop the hood to the secondary release. So all modern vehicles will have two different release systems, so that if for whatever reason the hood gets unlatched, there's a secondary latch to try to support it, so that the hood doesn't go flying up and hit the windshield. And this is something that actually is legit. It's not one of those things that you want to have happen if you're driving a vehicle. You don't want the hood to come flying up and smack the windshield and obscure your view. So there is a secondary latch. So you have to pop the hood, go out, remove the secondary latch, or open the secondary latch, which is usually a little bit of lever, and then lift the hood up, and then you have access. Now, some vehicles, again, will have the hood release in different areas. So for instance, every generation of Viper, from generation 1 all the way to generation 5, all of the hood releases are all outside of the vehicle. So you can go up to any Viper at any time and pop the hood. They're all in different spots. It's like the Gen 1 Vipers all have it in a particular spot in the front grille, and a majority of the Gen 3, 4, and 5s do as well. Gen 5s, it's below the fender, but it gives you an idea. You do need to look to where that is. You also want to make sure too, after you're done checking fluid levels, you want to make sure everything's capped, and then also that the hood is secure and that the lock system is down all the way, and there's no weirdness with any of the hood possibly coming up. And you want to make sure you're keeping track of that. The other thing that you want to make sure that you're understanding is when you're going to actually check for these fluids. I like to personally check for fluid condition and a fluid level at gas fill ups about once a month. Now, depending on the vehicle, you might need to do this more often. Some vehicles, especially vehicles that consume a fair amount of engine oil, you probably want to be doing this about every week. You want to go out, when you fill up or before you leave, if you have a little bit of time before you're going to school or work or wherever, you pop the hood, check the fluid levels really quick, and then you go. And I have a set of rags in my side door pocket that I I put out and use for checking the fluid levels. When my daily driver was consuming a lot more oil, I was checking it every week. And now that it's got a little bit fresher motor in it, it's about once a month, but it's still one of those things you want to check on a regular basis, especially now. So, depending on the weather, right? So you're getting into like hotter season. We're about to get into triple digit temps here. You need to be checking your coolant on a regular basis, because coolant's one of those things that when it leaves quick. Now other fluids like power steering and brake fluid, you kind of doing a cursory glance. You're not really checking whether or not it needs to be replaced or serviced or replaced or filled. You're more or less checking it just to make sure that you don't have a massive leak, or that there's not some other issue that's going on with the vehicle. It is important to make sure that we are using the correct fluid types. Most owner's manuals will have the fluid type listed in the owner's manual either under maintenance or under getting started with your vehicle. It kind of depends. Now, you need to make sure that you do have this of an understanding. A lot of modern vehicles now, they're negating this from the owner's manual. And so then you'd have to go to a repair manual. Now, when you inherently buy a vehicle, you don't get a repair manual. So you need to access that. We're pretty lucky though that we can do a pretty quick Google search, and that will then give us access to the proper fluid levels. Just be careful with that. Google's getting pretty bad into where they're really only looking for selling ads, not as much giving you information. So having access to a good factory service manual will give you that. And have a big understanding too that there is no such thing as universal fluids. So you might go to a gas station or a parts store and they might say, oh, this is universal fluid. That is not the case. There is no such thing as universal fluid. And you need to make sure you're using the specific stuff for that specific job. Now, if we look at this as an example of an engine bay with a PT Cruiser, I have one here, and that's what we'll be looking at to kind of give an example of that. So as we look in the engine bay of this particular car, we have a bunch of different fluid level checks that we're going to be looking for. So starting up front here, we have our engine oil. Now, atypically, we're going to talk about these each individually, but atypically our engine oil is going to be a yellow or a red dipstick, and it's just going to be as easily accessible as we possibly can. Now, this dipstick, we don't want to get confused with this dipstick. This dipstick right here is our transmission fluid dipstick. This is going to be used for checking our automatic transmission fluid. If we have a manual transmission, which I'll show you here in a little bit, that's going to be a little bit different. But our automatic transmission fluid level, we don't want to get confused with our engine. And again, when we're looking at draining the fluids, this is going to be one of those things that we want to change up and make sure we're checking so that we're not draining the wrong thing. Engine oil is pretty cheap. We talked about in the last lab, engine oil is about, 30 bucks. Transmission fluid, depending on what type of vehicle it is, especially when you look at vehicles with ZF transmissions, you're looking at it being almost like $60 to $90 a quart, and they can hold up to 8 quarts. So we want to make sure we're not draining the wrong thing and we're not checking the wrong thing. There's also going to be a couple big characteristic changes. So when we look at the dipstick on the engine oil, we have a small dipstick tube that's just big enough for the actual dipstick itself. If we look at the transmission dipstick tube, it's a much larger diameter, and the reason for that is this dipstick tube also is the fill point for our automatic transmission. So again, kind of can tell the difference. A lot of manufacturers will change the colors, so they'll change this to red often to signify that this is automatic transmission. Now, if we look at some of the other fluid fill ports, so if we go to the right side of the vehicle here, we have 2 different caps. So our first cap here, this is going to be our radiator cap. Now, when we have a cap like this, it's metal. They're oftentimes plastic now. This is going to be our pressure cap. So this will have a pressure reading that this needs to be set to. So in this case, we have I know it's not coming out on the camera very well, but it is an 18 PSI cap. So it says right there. It also says do not open when hot. Now, to judge on when it is hot, if you take the back of your hand and you put the back of your hand over the top of this, if you can feel heat radiating up, that's going to be too hot and you don't want to open this. If you open this, it will flash boil and you can get very, very badly burned. Because the cooling system is under pressure, so this is holding it at 18 PSI, For every single PSI that we're able to pressurize the cooling system, we're able to increase the boiling point by 3 degrees. So 18 PSI is jumping up that boiling point to a considerable amount to where it will flash boil the coolant. And we don't want to be able to take this off. Now, so if you're checking your fluid level at a gas station, you're not going to check the coolant level here, you're going to check it there. This is our coolant overflow bottle. And the coolant overflow bottle oftentimes will have a scale on the side of it. Now, this being pretty atypical of an older vehicle, the plastic is all faded and you can't really see it. So oftentimes you need to, shake the bottle or put a flashlight kind of down the filler to kind of gauge where the fluid level is, or you can pop it off and you can then, look down to see how low or high the coolant level is. It's important to understand when we're checking coolant level, we're going to be checking that with the vehicle cold and the coolant contracted, not expanded. When it's expanded, it can seem a lot fuller and it has a tendency to overflow. Now, going back to this side right over here, so we talked about our coolant fill. We also have our oil fill cap. Now, our oil fill cap is going to be where we're going to fill this up with engine oil if necessary. Oftentimes, it's going to have the little genie bottle oil container on it, or oil filler, and then it also will have the weight. So this is specifying that we are going to need 5W30 weight engine oil. And the little book is indicating that it wants us to look at the owner's manual to make sure. Based off of temperature and the region you're at, you might be using different oil weight. If you're dealing with cooler temperatures, you're going to be dealing with oil that's a little bit thicker versus if it's a little bit colder. So that's going to only be for filling the oil. So if we find that our oil dipstick is low, then we'd fill any oil there, or if we're doing any type of service work. Now, we already kind of talked about the coolant fill. The other fill that we're going to have over here in this corner is going to be our washer reservoir fill. No, that's going to be the first thing that we'll talk about in detail. So I'll when we get back to the slide deck, I'll talk about that a little more. But that will be for the washer nozzles for our wiper blades. Level for that, you really don't have a level. A lot of these systems will have, if you can't see the reservoir, which in this case we can't, it goes down. And even if we were to flip that cap up, that's just a tube going down to a reservoir lower down in the fender here. We're looking at, that there'll be a level sensor and there'll be a light on in the dash. It's not critical. It is one of those things that, yeah, if you, drive through like a swarm of bees or bugs or anything and you need to rinse the windshield off, you want to make sure that you have the access to doing that. But again, we'll talk about the fluid in a little bit greater detail with that. As we kind of migrate over, there's one other cap on this far right corner that I'm going to point out. On the PT Cruiser that's on the slide deck, this cap and reservoir for the power steering is located here. This is a turboed vehicle, so it's up front. Same thing, our power steering fluid, if we have hydraulic power steering, we'll have a reservoir with fluid, and the reservoir can either be remote, meaning that it's mounted somewhere else in the engine bay, usually along the corners or the edges, or it can be mounted directly to the pump like this one is. So this one's a little bit low, it's mounted directly to it. We can either have it be an opaque container that we can look at the fluid level, or it can be like this one, where we do a half twist and it has a dipstick, and the dipstick is going to be where we're going to look at fluid. So we can see I have a mark right there on that dipstick showing the fluid level for this power steering fluid. Now, a lot of modern vehicles now are getting rid of hydraulic power steering, and they're either going with electric hydraulic power steering, which you'll still have a reservoir, but the reservoir typically is going to be buried in a fender, or they will go to fully electric systems, and fully electric systems do not have any power steering fluid. They will have some grease and oil inside of the steering rack itself, but that's non-serviceable. It's serviced with the rack, so it's not even something that you could drain or get to easily. Now, if we move to the left side of the vehicle, so this being a left-hand drive vehicle, our brake master cylinder and reservoir are on the firewall on the left side, right below the PCM here. And the fluid level for this needs to be checked fairly regular. Now, if the fluid level is low in the brake system, we're not going to go through and top it off. And we'll talk about that in a little bit greater detail. But this reservoir on a lot of hybrid electric vehicles can be remote mounted as well, just like the power steering. For the most part, for internal combustion engine powered vehicles, it'll always be part of the master cylinder and located in this general area. Right-hand drive cars, obviously the other side. But when we're looking at hybrid vehicles, because they're using unconventional brake systems and oftentimes brake simulators to simulate hydraulic brakes, the reservoir can be relocated. So Priuses famously have it located opposite wherever the master cylinder actuator is. But when we look at that, again, it's an opaque container that's going to give you, a min max mark. And again, over time, you can't really see it, and you kind of got to wiggle it to see that where the fluid level's at. The last thing that that we can look at fluid wise, and again, on modern vehicles, we're not really looking at it, is going to be the batteries. The battery on this vehicle is located right up front here. Modern batteries are all sealed batteries that you're not going to be checking the electrolyte fluid with. If you had an old deep cycle battery, or like a recreational vehicle, an RV or something, a boat, you might have a deep cycle battery that you add distilled water to, and you pull off the caps, and you'd have 6 little ports or 2 ports covering 3 apiece to be able to fill that with distilled water. And distilled water is key. You need to make sure that you're not adding any extra electrolysis in that system. Sealed batteries like this is a lead acid battery, so there is electrolyte inside of it. However, we're not looking at servicing this whatsoever. But what you do want to look for is if on any of the terminals we have kind of growth, so a white or a green kind of powder that's forming around the post here, that is an indication that that battery has a leak. It's expanded out, and oftentimes you can look and see the end cases here are swollen, and that's going to be something that we do want to look for in terms of the battery not living a long life. We might be able to clean and service this, but usually if we have growth coming off of these battery terminals, that is a telltale sign that the battery is on its way out, or it's had a really bad vibration and it's shaking. In terms of other things you check under the hood when it comes to fluid level checks, we talked about all the different fluids under here, but you're also looking at hoses. So like we can see the upper radiator hose here, it does go under the intake manifold to the thermostat housing where our radiator cap is. We'd be looking for any other type of oil leaks or anything along that line. And again, you want to do this about every month. You pop the hood of the vehicle and actually get an understanding of what's going on in here. If you have mounts that you can be checking, your air filter you can check, which is under this guy's box. Again, depending on the area you're driving in, it's anywhere between 15,000 to 30,000 miles. In some places that aren't as dusty, it's 40,000 miles. Here in Southern California, that needs to be changed about every 15,000 miles to continue to get decent gas mileage. But you're going to be kind of just checking around everything here, taking the leaves all off of the parcel shelf right up here, or the cowl area, I should say, not partial shelf, excuse me, so that doesn't clog any of the drains going down to the fender and create rust or anything along that lines. And again, it's going to be different from car to car. Every car is a little bit different in terms of layout and how you're going to check it. And we'll look at another car here in a little bit. I figured it's probably a little bit better to show you all a live vehicle than it was, the vehicle on picture. So when we look at, our picture here for the textbook, the big difference that we're going to have is our reservoir for power steering's in a different location, the airbox is a little bit different shape. Again, every car is a little bit different. You kind of want to get familiarized with your own personal vehicle. So let's start with each individual type of fluid. We'll start with washer fluid. Washer fluid here in Southern California isn't that big of a deal. You're looking at, you really just need to have, distilled water with a little bit of soap. It is important to understand that when you buy this stuff from the parts store, that this is going to be concentrate, and it does need to be diluted down. If you pour the container straight in, and it's the full soap, fill, it is something that you want to make sure that we are diluting down, because it will clog the pump. Usually it's not the end of the world. Usually there's a little tiny filter on most vehicles' pumps, and you just have to separate it. It makes a big mess because all the fluid leaks out. But then you just clean that out with some water, and hopefully the pump is savable. Most manufacturers are using the same exact pump. Nothing's really kind of out of the ordinary with that. They're all typically pretty basic pumps that you can get. It is one of those things, if you're in an area that does get cold, so if it gets below freezing, you want to make sure that you're getting windshield washer fluid that has some antifreeze in it, so that it doesn't freeze up. It is important to understand when a lot of liquids like water, water being the basis for this, freeze, they expand. and expands, and that will, pop the reservoir bottle, and that potentially can cause some damage to the vehicle. However, it is one of those things that it's not the end of the world if you don't have any antifreeze in it. And again, for the most part, a lot of you are probably going to run it dry and then just fill it up with regular water. Personally, I just fill it with water. Not that big a deal when it comes to these. Now, I have been utilize this reservoir for other things. There's a friend of mine's vehicle that it's a pretty heavily modified vehicle that's turbocharged, that we methanol injected. So we did water methanol injection, where we'd actually spray that into the boost hose and have that go and cool down the intake charge. We actually used the washer reservoir for that because the car wasn't going to. He kept his car detailed enough to where it wasn't that big of a deal. We utilized the same reservoir. We added separate pump. The pump is not capable of handling the methanol to run through it, but is definitely something different that you can do. Now, our engine oil. Engine oil, again, we're going to be checking with the dipstick. There are a couple vehicles out there that do not have dipsticks. A couple German vehicles now have eliminated the engine oil dipstick. Why they do that is for the reason of they don't want people messing with it. So if a lot of vehicles that have service plans or maintenance built into the cost of the vehicle, so you're looking at a lot of luxury vehicles, BMW, Mercedes, Audi, they have eliminated dipsticks for the transmission, power steering, engine oil, because they don't want any cross-contamination of fluid. There is a procedure that you can use the cluster to look to see your oil level, but it is one of those things that it's not always the same for every vehicle, and in a lot of cases you have to have the factory scan tool to be able to do that. And again, that is to encourage the owner to go and get their vehicle serviced at that particular service center. Now, when we look at the dipstick itself, the dipstick is going to have a couple readings on it that we need to look and pay attention to. So when we're checking the engine oil level and we're checking the dipsticks, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be pulling the dipstick out, wiping it clean, and then checking the level from there. When we're doing that, what we're doing is we're getting an accurate level. If you were to just straight pull the dipstick out and check the level, that would then result in an incorrect reading, and it'll probably be full. And the reason why it'll be full is crankcase pressure will have pushed up a little bit of oil residue up that tube, and that will then be causing the dipstick to read incorrectly. So if I switch gears on cars really quick, so I'm going to go over to a different vehicle. This is a Mustang with a 3.8 liter V6. My dipstick is over here on this corner right here. This is a manual transmission vehicle, so we won't have a transmission dipstick, so we only have one. So this is going to be my engine oil dipstick. I'm going to pull this out, and then I'd wipe this clean with a rag. So I'll try to do this one-handed. Wipe this clean with a rag, make sure that there's no engine oil on it whatsoever. Put it back down its tube until it's fully seated, like so, and then pull it back out, and then now we're going to be able to see the level. So in this case, we can see I have some pretty dirty engine oil, and there's two dots that we're looking for. So there's a dot that's right over the alternator that you can see right through, and there's a dot that's covered with engine oil. In between those two dots is 1 quart of oil, and we're about dead center in the middle. I always like to flip it over as well, just to double check. So we flipped it over, same thing. I'm about midway through these two dots right there. Now, what that indicates is I'm in the safe zone. I am in the safe area for this engine oil in terms of level. So level wise, if I wanted to fill it all the way up, I would add 1 additional half quart, so half of a container of average engine oil to my oil fill right there. And then that would allow for the dipstick to show that it is completely full. As long as you're within the safe zone, so that area right in the middle, you don't have to worry about adding fluid. So in this case, for this particular vehicle, I wouldn't really particularly worry about adding more oil to it. We're right within that safe range. So if you look at the graphic on the PowerPoint, we're within the safe range. to where I don't have to sweat it, going to be running out of oil. I have a half quart before I'm below safe. If I get below that safe range or that little X, that little serration area, then that's an indication that I need to add oil. Now, after that, when it starts to get below it, you can't really judge on that. Most engine oil dipsticks are going to curve or come at an awkward angle. They're not always the primary focus on manufacturers when it comes to placement. So if it's getting really below the safe mark or getting towards the end, you're multiple quarts low, and you need to, at that point, then possibly look at why you're losing that much oil. Now, condition wise, we looked at that engine oil, and that engine oil is pretty dark in color, and that's because this engine's definitely due for an oil change. It is going to require an oil change sooner rather than later. And again, you're going to want to look at that owner's manual to depend on when you need to be servicing this. This is a vehicle from the 2000s, so the rule of thumb of 3 months or 3,000 miles stands true with it. Looking at the condition is also a good key factor with that. So with this, even if we haven't gone that 3,000 miles, but it definitely has been driven hot, we want to look at, we probably want to change the fluid level on this guy. So that would be something that we'd go through and change as an oil change. But looking at this, I wouldn't top off this engine oil. However, I'd want to keep notes. So let's say, let's use this as a kind of a theory in practice. Let's ignore the condition for now, and let's mainly look at the fact that the engine oil is about halfway on the dipstick. If I go another month and the engine oil is below that, and considerably below that, then I'm looking at consuming engine oil for some reason. I'm either consuming engine oil or I'm leaking engine oil. So if you start to see your oil level drop considerably, first thing you obviously check for is an oil leak. It's the most common and it's the easiest way to source it. You won't always be able to see it on the ground. I get that all the time from customers in the shop where they go, oh yeah, no, I didn't see any oil on the ground, so I don't know, I never noticed an oil leak. A lot of modern vehicles now have big under trays that have absorption pads built into them, and that will soak up or absorb the engine oil from leaking everywhere, and that will then give them kind of a false reading on what they possibly have. In the terms of this vehicle doesn't have that as the case, and we're going to lift it up here in a little bit to look at the transmission fluid level. So we'll see if there's an oil leak, if that's why it's a half quart low. More often than not, this being a higher mileage vehicle, this vehicle has something like 135,000 miles on it. It's probably consuming oil. Now, it is well within the normal operating range of an internal combustion engine to burn up to 1 quart of oil for every 1,000 miles. Now, let's think about that here for a second, right? This vehicle is a little bit older and we should be changing it every 3,000 miles. The capacity on this car is 5 quarts with an oil filter during an oil change. So in normal service, we're putting 5 new quarts in this. If we're extending out our range for our oil change, for instance, let's say we are going off of more modern vehicles service intervals where we're servicing every 7,500 miles, and we're not checking the fluid level, the oil level regularly, there is a period where we might run out of engine oil. We might not have enough engine oil to power the vehicle or to lubricate the vehicle, and the vehicle will effectively damage the lower end. So it is one of those things that is really paramount that we're checking it on a regular basis, especially if we're using fully synthetic engine oils and we have a little bit longer range that's acceptable from the factory. Personally, I drive a turbocharged Subaru, so I don't go over 2,500 miles in between oil changes, but that's just me because Subarus have a tendency to consume oil and they also have a tendency to blow up, and I don't want that to happen again. I've already had to deal with that, so I'd like to avoid that in the future. So that's why I service it and change the oil on a consistent basis. However, other vehicles, if you're using good quality synthetic oil and a good quality oil filter, you can go a little bit longer, and you don't have to worry about that. But either way, regardless of what service maintenance you're following and regardless of what quality oil, you should be checking it about every month. And again, the best way to do it is just to do it at a gas station, because the gas station is going to have paper towel that you can wipe the dipstick off on. Again, I like to leave shop rags in my door card, and I use those. However, do keep in mind, especially in hot temperatures, and I have to probably go and change them out now that I'm thinking about it, rags can spontaneously combust in heat, especially heat of a car, and the heat of a car sitting parked outside. It's going to get a lot hotter than it otherwise would. So we want to make sure that we're not potentially having a fire risk inside of our vehicle. A lot of customers will shove rags, I've seen, like in the engine bay, and again, that's can be detrimental. Having a roll of Scott's blue paper towel is a good idea inside of the vehicle. That way you're not running the risk of catching the vehicle on fire or having anything where it's going to spontaneously combust. So, but engine oil level is going to be the kind of probably the most paramount fluid that we're going to be checking on an average vehicle. Now, when we look at automatic transmission fluid, automatic transmission fluid, as the book says, is going to be usually a pinkish red. Here's the big disclaimer with that. That's atypical for older vehicles. More modern vehicles, however, do not have that pinkish fluid in it, and they don't have that dye. As well as, if you're looking at what type of vehicle it is, if it is a CVT transmission vehicle, for instance, that'll have green fluid in it. So don't always go off of that it's supposed to be red or a pinkish color, but we can use that kind of just as a default if that's the case. It is very, very paramount. So engine oil is important to get the right oil grade, but for the most part, if if the car calls for 0-20 and you use 520 or 530, you're going to be okay. However, with automatic transmission fluid, you absolutely have to use the recommended fluid from the manufacturer. You will do immediate damage to a transmission. And each manufacturer has their own, effectively flavor of automatic transmission fluid. If we look at the two bottles that we have set up right here, we have automatic transmission fluid for a Ford there on the right, and then we have Dextron on the left, and that is atypical for General Motors vehicles. And then each one of the other manufacturers, foreign manufacturers, whether or not it be European or Asian market vehicles, they will have their own version of automatic transmission fluid. So this is really, really key. For the most part, when we're looking at automatic transmission fluid and you're checking your level, you really only need to check the level if there's an issue with the transmission. If the transmission's shifting okay, if when you let off, if you're in gear, so in drive or reverse on flat ground, and you let off the brake and the vehicle is, creeps and will move on its own, do the torque converter, then you typically have a good fluid level in the transmission, and that's not going to be something that's going to be that much of a concern. You're mainly checking the automatic transmission fluid for condition. That's going to be the big thing that goes along with that, is checking to see what the condition of that fluid is before you are getting ready to service it. And again, you want to pay attention to service intervals. Vehicles that do have pinkish automatic transmission fluid, typically those service intervals for actually draining and refilling and possibly changing the filter on that transmission are going to be around 30,000 to 60,000 miles, depending on the severity of how you're driving. When we're looking at a lot of modern automatic transmissions, and when I say modern, I mean within the last 15 years, we're looking at that fluid being filled for life. Now, let me kind of go into that, because some of the other fluids we're going to be talking about from this point forward, excluding engine oil, is going to be fill for life. And what fill for life indicates is that that fluid is good for the life of the component. And so you're probably sitting there thinking, well, what is the life of the component? And the answer is nobody knows, not even the manufacturer. It's important to understand, me as a mechanic that works on at a dealership on a brand of vehicles, the models that I see come in are going to have faults with it. that's excluding the ones that have been sold, left, and have never had an issue after that. So we're looking at that being a situation where you can't always judge off of like what a mechanic's going to say in terms of, is this car a good car? Or there's, you know, the perceived knowledge. You look online and, oh yeah, this car is, this make is junk, this make's not. The important thing to understand is every car has faults, and every car can go a really, really long mileage without having any of those faults, depending on, you know, if the stars align and there's no issues. So when we're looking at automatic transmission fluid, for instance, on average, that fluid should be able to go, if it is specified fill for life, 150 to 300,000 miles, give or take. Now, if we have a component failure before then, you're going to be changing the fluid out for that component failure. So if a valve body fails on a transmission, you have to drop the pan, change out the valve body. That will then lead to changing the fluid. So then, you know, you'd recycle that. So again, we're looking at, it's important to understand that some stuff is full for life, some stuff is not. And we need to understand that service interval. Now, in the terms of our little PT Cruiser that we have here, our little PT Cruiser, this does have an automatic transmission fluid level, and this does have fluid that we can check regularly. So my automatic transmission fluid dipstick is right here. And again, this is going to be a larger diameter dipstick. So that dipstick tube is large enough to where we can get a funnel in. Now, to check this fluid level, it's going to be very similar. We're going to have a long dipstick, and it will have two types of ranges on it. So we can see 4 dots on this dipstick. The dot that's going to be the 2 dots that are closest to the right side or the lower end of the dipstick, that is going to be the cold fill range. And the 2 dots that are on the left side of the dipstick, or, you know, going up the height of the dipstick, that is the warm range. Now, unlike the cooling system where you can kind of sort of get a judge for feeling or look at the gauge, automatic transmission fluid likes to live at 175 degrees. That's its operating temperature. So you kind of need a scan tool and the ability to look at the data to be able to tell what temperature range this is going to be at. The other thing that we're doing is I've pulled the dipstick out with the vehicle off. This is not how you check the fluid level. On this particular vehicle, the way that we're going to be checking the automatic transmission fluid level is with the engine on, the engine at idle, and it in park. And what that will do is that will be circulating fluid through the pump. I will do the same thing with this dipstick as I would with the engine oil dipstick. I'd wipe it clean, put it back down the bore, and then I would check the level and see where the level is. And based off of the temperature, if I'm looking at the scan tool or data, it would either be in the cold range or the warm range, and I need to be within that safe zone. What I don't want to do is I don't want to be past that little ridge right there. That ridge right there is to prevent the dipstick from getting stuck. It also too is the stopper on fluids expanded out, and it is going to come out through the top of the dipstick or the transmission vent. Typically it comes out through the transmission vent if it is overfilled. Now, kind of backtracking because I skipped over it, if our engine oil is overfilled, engine oil being overfilled is just as bad as it being underfilled. If it is overfilled by any amount, we do need to remove that because that can cavitate the engine oil, which is called foaming it. And cavitation is a term for foaming the fluid, and that will then break down the oil a lot faster. It will run at a higher temperature, and it will do damage to our bearings. Transmission fluid also has the ability to cavitate if it gets past that little ridge right there, but atypically it'll either spit itself out of the dipstick, or there's a transmission vent. This being a transaxle vehicle or transmissions below the airbox right here, there's a vent on that it'll actually spit out and leak any excess out, which again causes a giant mess. Now, in terms of condition, we can sort of see through the hole that I have centered on that inlet hose right there that we are a pinkish red. However, with automatic transmission fluid, the best thing to determine condition is to actually smell it. Transmission fluid, it's dyed red so that you can see if it starts to get burned. However, you can have people service their automatic transmissions, and that then results in the fluid kind of, you know, looking okay, but still being burnt. The smell that you're going for, you're going for a like a burned popcorn smell. You're looking for it basically has gotten hot enough to where it's breaking the fluid down. Now, automatic transmission fluid, as it exceeds that operating temperature, and again, it likes to be at 175 degrees. Between 170 and 180 is the happy spot for automatic transmission fluid. If it starts to exceed that, it breaks down the fluid, and the hotter it gets, the faster it breaks down the fluid, and the less life that fluid has. The best way to get a good feel for that is if you go through and you smell it, and you actually smell what the fluid looks like. So let's look at manual transmission. So I'm going to lift up our Mustang really quick, and we will take a gander underneath. All right, so when we're looking at getting under and servicing our manual transmissions aren't going to have a dipstick. They instead are going to have a drain and fill port. Now, the reason for this is automatic transmissions do not have a typical lubrication system. They're splash lubricated. So I can see right here, this is my drain for my automatic transmission, and my fill is on the other side. And so there's going to be a port on the other side here that I'm going to use to fill it, or sorry, it's on this side. Excuse me. It's right above it. So right above it, right above that electrical connector right there is going to be my fill. So I'm going to fill this system up to a certain level, and then that will be the fluid that it has. And the way that you're going to check it is based off of the slide that I have on screen right here. So if I look on screen, I can see that on the PowerPoint, if I take that fill plug out, the fluid needs to be right at the threads of right at the bottom of that port. And that's going to be how much fluid is going to be needed for this. And there's not going to be as much. Again, it's passively lubricated at this point. So if I go through and I show you on screen under the vehicle. All right, so right in the middle of the screen is I can see my drain plug, and then directly above it, we can see another machine boss. That is my fill plug. So my fill plug I would take out, and I would then see the fluids dripping down. And again, I just have a fill and a drain in the case of this particular transmission. This is a T5 World Class. So I wouldn't be doing much else other than that. Now, checking fluid level, again, we talked about checking it every month. Again, you're checking this only if there's really an issue. Now, underneath this transmission, we don't have any type of dipstick. This is very atypical for a manual transmission. A lot of modern automatics are going this way as well, where we've eliminated the dipstick altogether. And the reason for that is, again, so that customers don't mess with it. Now, in manual transmissions, why they've done that is it's more along the lines of where we're not requiring it to be regularly serviced. We also don't have any type of pump or anything. The fluid level is just what it's at. Now, service-wise for a manual transmission, it's going to be very similar to that of an automatic. You want to check the service interval, and it's going to be anywhere between 30 to 60,000 miles, depending on the vehicle and depending on the severity of how it's driven. Now, fluid-wise, so what I have photoed is that's clearly a fill port, and it's red coming out of there. That's the important thing. So very much like automatic transmission fluids, we're also looking for making sure we have the correct manual fluid, transmission fluid. The way that it normally works is if it is going to be an automatic transmission, or if it's going to be a manual transmission, and it's going to have paper synchro rings or paper blocker rings to assist in shifting the gears, that will then use automatic transmission fluid. If it has brass or bronze shifter blocker rings, then we're going to be using gear oil of some sort. And manual transmissions can use kind of a run of a bunch of different fluids. Older manual transmissions, they'll use like thicker gear oil, but more modern ones will use engine oil. So, like for instance, if you were to go get a mid 2000s Mercedes 230 compressor with a stick shift, that NSG transmission, the oil in it that it's going to take is 5W30 engine oil. So the engine takes 540, the transmission takes 530, and that's pretty atypical. There's also a lot of vehicles too. So there's vehicles like older Austin Minis that they utilize the same engine oil and crankcase all in one. And there's a couple Saabs that way as well. So that's pretty atypical. So with manual transmissions, it's not as crucial. If you have paper synchro rings and you're not using automatic transmission fluid, it will damage it immediately. But again, you're looking at the fluid condition as it comes out or as you're checking it. And again, you're only really checking it if there's an issue or if there's a leak. As you can see under the Mustang, there's definitely a little bit of a leak, and that's because we do utilize this vehicle on a regular basis for clutch services. So it's been in and out quite a few times, and that's why there is some fluid level or fluid leaking out of it. Now, CVTs, I kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier. Again, this is an automatic transmission, and it's an automatically shifting vehicle. However, it does not utilize the same dye. It uses green dye, and also will have a different type of smell. In some cases, CVTs will have a fill and a drain plug, very similar to a manual. In other cases, it will have a dipstick. It really kind of depends on the vehicle. CVT fluid usually is serviced about every 60 to 80,000 miles. And so when that CVT comes due for service, it is going to be important that we utilize the correct fluid. For the most part, manufacturers are all using the same CVT manufacturer. So they're going to be similar fluid level, similar fluid type. And again, you're going to be looking at its service interval based off of, how the vehicle is being used, so on and so forth. Now, going into engine coolants. Engine coolants can be kind of unique. When we're looking at engine coolant, we're looking at needing to have an understanding of what the construction of the engine is and what the vehicle is being used for. Coolant in more hotter states isn't as big of a deal as it is in colder states. In colder states, we need to make sure we have a certain level of antifreeze. That's going to be the amount of material in the coolant that is going to prevent that fluid from freezing. West Coast vehicles or vehicles in a little hotter climates, the antifreeze isn't as important because we're not looking at the coolant ever freezing. However, we do want to make sure we have that because the antifreeze mixture will have lubrication properties for the water pump and other coolant components, as well as it will also prevent corrosion inside of the engine. Now, very early all cast iron engines, they were utilizing a inorganic acid type or an IAT type coolant. This is typically referred to as a green coolant, and it is a coolant that does not live a very long life. Only about 2 years or 48,000 miles. If you're in a very, very cold climate that does freeze, you're looking at having to winterize your vehicle every year. So you're looking at changing the coolant about every year so that you don't have your cooling system freeze. Because if the cooling system freezes, again, water expanding as it freezes, it can crack the block. Again, not necessarily a thing that we typically have to worry about in warmer climate states. As we started to get to different engine constructions, so we moved away from all cast iron components and we started to implement aluminum components. And it started with cast iron engine blocks, but aluminum cylinder heads. We then needed to change up the corrosive characteristics of that coolant. So as that coolant broke down in acid types, that would actually etch and eat away at the aluminum because the aluminum is a much softer material. And we would look at that potentially would be a cause for a failure of a major component, head gasket, or worse, that porous cylinder head or a porous block once we started to use aluminum blocks. So that we then changed to an organic acid type or an oat style coolant. That coolant is atypically like a orangish, amberish red. I've seen it yellow. A lot of German vehicles, they'll dye it blue. There also is a couple vehicles out there. Usually they're Kias and Hyundais, the Korean market vehicles, that it will still be green for that dye. It's important to understand that the dye is not in the formula of that fluid, that it is just a dye to be able to discern between engine oil and coolant. Atypically though, whether or not it's an acid based or an organic based, we're looking at that fluid kind of having a sweet smell, and that will kind of be the determining factor, as well as it'll be far more viscous because it'll be liquid. To where the engine oil, will be be able to flow, but it will resist that flow a little bit more because of its higher viscosity. We can also have a hybrid or HOT coolant, I should say, and that is hybrid organic acid coolant. And that there's a little bit of a typo here on the book. That's usually 10-year, 150,000 mile coolant. That is, it also says that it's yellow or red. That coolant is tending to be now more purple. And the purple is an indication that it's a little bit different. It is important to understand that if you go to a parts store, they're going to have universal coolant. You normally only can get the proper coolant for your vehicle from the dealership, which is a bit of a bummer because yes, it does mean that it is a little bit more expensive. However, you do want to use the proper coolant, mainly for you don't want to have any corrosion buildup or anything along that line. You want it to not break down, not eat away the cooling system, and not have any issues with that. All coolants do get mixed, so you can buy it in a concentrate or you can buy it as a premix. Ideally, we're going to be mixing it with distilled water. Again, distilled water is a purification method to eliminate the heavy minerals from the water so that we are less likely to have corrosion buildup. So we do want to make sure that we are looking at that and that we're getting the proper distilled water in. I'll be honest, at the dealership that I work at for, been there for over 16 years, we've always used just the water that comes out of the hose. That's just the way that it goes. But if it's your own vehicle, do you use distilled water and make sure that you're using the proper mixture of coolant. For the most part, when we're looking at mixing of coolant, it's going to be a 50-50 or a 70-30 mix. And that's, 50% distilled water, 50% coolant. The higher concentrate of coolant that you have, that will be for colder climates. So that will be, the colder the climate is, the more coolant you obviously want. The hotter the climate is, the more water that you're going to have. So out here in Southern California, we'd probably have a 70-30 mix, but a 50-50 mix is just fine. And again, you want to pay attention to the container. A lot of the stuff that you buy from parts stores is already pre-mixed. So it's pre-mixed, 50% distilled water, 50% coolant, and you would not need to pre-mix it at all. There is, so there's a company called Evans that makes waterless coolant. That stuff does work. It's very expensive for what it is, and it will reduce operating temperatures. The downside to it is the system needs to be completely water free. So you need to have a dry system before you fill it with their product, and you can only ever top it off with their product. So if you do have a leak or you have some expansion on some hoses and it kind of burps a little bit of fluid out, then you'd have to fill it with their fluid. In terms of checking the level, again, always check the level cold for coolant. You can eyeball it in the reservoir when it's warm, but we're always going to be checking it cold. We do not want to open that pressure bottle hot or that pressure cap hot. Oftentimes the pressure bottle or pressure cap will be on the radiator itself. If it is a metal cap or a hard plastic cap, keep an eye on it. If it says do not open hot, that's indicating that that is a pressure cap. And again, that will have a little marking on it, either in bar or in PSI. Atypically, we're looking at cooling systems being under pressure for around, as low as I've seen is 12 psi, all the way up to about 21 psi. Most of the time, it's 16 to 18. And again, test question that you're going to see, for every 1 psi that we pressurize the cooling system, it increases the boiling point by 3 degrees. So if you take it off, it will flash boil, and we're always checking it when the coolant level is cold. The other reason why we're always checking the coolant level cold is because that is when the coolant is then contracted. It's not as hot. It's going to kind of revert back and fill different voids up, and we can actually see if it's low at that point. So we always want to make sure we're checking that. And the coolant level is going to have a range. It's going to move up and down as we heat up and cool down the vehicle. So you might be looking at the vehicle at a time when the coolant level is just a little bit low, and that's fine. There's nothing the matter with that. So if we look at my Mustang here, my Mustang does have a coolant issue. So I have my coolant pressure cap right here. So this is on the radiator itself. So the radiator cap is stating that this is a oops, close the lens, sorry about that, that this is a 16 psi cap. And again, we want to make sure that this is locked and tight. We're not going to touch this. Again, to see if it's too hot, to check the level, we're going to put our hand over it and see if we have heat radiating off of this. Now, we do have a non-pressurized overflow bottle. Depending on the vehicle's design, you might not have the radiator cap on the radiator, the pressure cap. That's why I keep referring to it as a pressure cap, because often this can be mounted on a bottle, and the bottle mounted somewhere else. If it's a sleeker vehicle that has a lower radiator cowl or hood, this might be located at a different point. Typically, we're going to try to locate the filler cap or the radiator cap, pressure cap, at the highest point in the cooling system. And oftentimes that can be somewhere else located in the vehicle. In the terms of this vehicle, this cap is a little bit lower than our highest point, which is those two hoses right there. Those two hoses right there are heater hoses. So when we do go to service this cooling system, we do have to bleed the cooling system out. That's what this little guy is right here. So this little coolant hose, this is our highest point. So if we were to fill this up during a service, we would have to undo that, fill through the radiator cap, and then once we have water coming out through there, we would cap that and then continue filling it until this fills all the way up. And this area will push out the air. That is higher than those two heater hoses over there, so we won't get an airlock. It is important on these cooling systems that we have no air in the system. The best way to check if you do have air in the system is turn the heater on. Again, with the heater lines back there, it is one of those things that we would have an air pocket fill up the in the heater core first, and the heater will not blow hot. So if you see, if you're on a road trip and the vehicle starts to overheat, you may have heard, your dad or your uncle or someone with some old school knowledge say to turn the heater on, because that acts as an extra radiator up there, because that does go to a heater core, and that is true. Once that starts blowing cold, that's where you've lost enough coolant to where there's no coolant going up to that area. It's also the way that I judge if I've gotten all the air out of the system through the bleeder right there. For the most part, though, when we're checking our fluid level, we're going to be going through our reservoir right here. Now, whether or not it's a pressurized reservoir or whether or not it's a non-pressurized like what we have here is going to be dependent on the vehicle. Now, in this case, this is a non-pressurized reservoir, so I can pull this cap off at any time, and it's not that big of a deal. Now, these are, plastic opaque, so we should have a level on it. And in this case, we can see that I have a couple lines on it. So there's a mark down there for low, and then there's a mark right there, a notch right there in the side for full. And in this case, I have nothing in the reservoir, or what I have in the reservoir is very low. So if I shake this, you can see right below the low mark. If I shake it again, you can see some coolant dancing around. Now, in this case, the car is cold, so I would want to add coolant to it. And I would want to add coolant about midway between those two notches. If I got it all the way up to that notch, it could have a tendency to want to burp the cooling system out. And what that means is that as the coolant expands, it comes out and then it will actually spit onto the ground. In some cases, there's going to be a little hose. In this case, on this reservoir, it just comes out through the cap because the cap's pretty passive. It's just a little, pop cap. But with the coolant level that low, we would want to double check my cap. Now this is cold. The vehicle hasn't been running, so I can take this off and check to see if the coolant level's there. So in this case, if I go around, I can see no coolant in the reservoir. So if I stick my pinky down, it's coming out dry. So this is an indication that I do have a coolant leak and I need to probably do some diagnosis. On this particular vehicle, I know what it is. It's my lower radiator hose clamp down there is a little bit leaky, and I need to service that at some point for this particular vehicle. When we're looking at reinstalling this cap, there's going to be 2 notches on most of these. Those have to correspond with the actual opening itself. So you're going to get it down, and then you're going to rotate this until it locks. If I don't locate it and lock it, then this won't be holding pressure and the system will have the tendency to boil over. If it has room in the reservoir, it'll all fill that up. But for the most part, usually it leaks everywhere. So you do want to make sure that this is nice and firmly locked. This is also a wear item. This is something that you will have to potentially change periodically. So it is going to be something we'll talk about in chapter 12 a little bit more in detail when we talk about cooling systems. So if we get back to the PowerPoint, now on gasoline vehicles, again, we're looking at having a single cooling system. For hybrid vehicles or electric vehicles, we're going to have multiple cooling systems. In some cases, we can have up to 3. The reason for that is high voltage battery systems operate a lot better when they're fully cooled, and it's usually better to have them water cooled. So in this case, on this Chrysler Pacifica that I have photoed below, I have 3 different reservoirs. I have the engine reservoir, which is the larger one in the middle, closest to that engine cover. And then I have 2 smaller reservoirs. These smaller reservoirs are a lot lower PSI rating. They're 5 PSI versus the 21 PSI of the main reservoir there. And they are just cooling electrical systems. So the one in the front, the forwardmost one closest to the headlight and the grille there, that is for the high voltage systems. So that is for the motor generator unit, otherwise known as the transmission, the belt alternator starter, and the high voltage electrics on top of the engine. That needs to operate at a particular temperature, and it will have its own radiator. The other one next to the main engine reservoir that's on the left side of the engine bay closest to the fender, that is the battery reservoir, and that will also have its own heat exchanger or its own radiator. So in this case, on the front of this vehicle, we will have 3 individual radiators, 3 individual coolant loops, and 3 individual reservoirs, all of which we need to check the level to. This is one of those things. I actually have a video posted up on my YouTube page showing a vehicle that has very, very minimal collision damage, but is fully totaled because they ruptured the front heat exchanger for the high voltage battery system, or sorry, the high voltage motor system, excuse me, and it totaled the vehicle effectively because they drove it with no coolant, overheated, and it melted itself down. So we do want to make sure if we do get in any type of collision with electrified vehicles, that we are looking for any type of fluid leak, and usually it's best to tow it and have it fully inspected. That way we don't run the risk of damaging extremely expensive componentry and totaling out the vehicle unnecessarily. The vehicle that I have show in the video, it's a Pacifica or Chrysler Pacifica van, and it probably needs $2,000 worth of body work in terms of a bumper cover. But it's upwards of $20,000 in terms of motor generator unit, so on and so forth. And that's just to get it started, let alone if it needed a battery pack or anything along those lines, because that heat exchanger was also ruptured, but the vehicle wouldn't even power up because it popped its main fuse. So again, we're looking at that causing a fair amount of damage to that particular vehicle. So it is one of those things we want to make sure we're paying attention to. And we kind of went over that. Gear oil. So this is going to be very similar to a manual transmission. This is going to be looking at the differential. It's going to have a fill plug. Not always will have a drain plug. A lot of vehicles, the drain plug is you remove the differential cover. But it's going to be the same thing as a manual transmission. You're going to take out the fill plug, and the fluid needs to be just below or right at the lower portion of the bore of that. And we need to make sure that it is filled to the proper level with the proper fluid. We're going to be using very thick gear oil, oftentimes in differentials. Some examples, 80W90. It can go upwards of 75-140 in some cases. The other thing that we want to make sure we're paying attention to is that when we're looking at a differential, that we're actually filling it, if it's limited slip, that we're making sure we have the proper limited slip additive to it. If we don't, then the differential will chatter and make noise going around corners and potentially can fail. Checking the differential fluid level, you're not going to that often. Again, this is during like an oil change, maybe is under the vehicle. You're not going to be expected to crawl under and check the fluid level at that point. It is important to understand if you have a four-wheel drive vehicle, so a 4x4 will require checking the rear differential, the front differential, and the transfer case. All three of those are going to be driveline components that need to have their fluid checked, and you're going to check it all at the same time, because again, it's going to be under the vehicle, and it's not going to be something that you're going to be doing on a regular basis, but you do during an oil change, or if you have someone change your oil for you. Power steering fluid level. We kind of talked about this on the PT Cruiser. The power steering fluid, you can have an opaque or a remote reservoir if it is a hydraulic system. Oftentimes you can have a dipstick, and a dipstick just needs to be in that range. So cold is all the way at the bottom, full is all the way at the top. There is no rhyme, no reason to the dipstick range. It's different for every vehicle. So if you're all the way down at the cold mark, it doesn't mean you add, half a pint or anything like that. It's just kind of whatever fluid or however much fluid it takes to get you within that safe range. Power steering systems like to talk to you if they're low on fluid. They will make kind of a whining noise, especially when you steer the steering wheel, that they are low on fluid and that you need to check it. So it is one of those things that it'll tell you when it is getting low, but you do want to check it regular basis. Again, service intervals on these can vary. Hydraulic fluid effectively is good for a long period of time, so this isn't one of the crucial things that you need to be servicing on a regular basis, but it is something that you do want to pay attention to. Most manufacturers, if they have hydraulic power steering systems and it's an automatic transmission vehicle, the automatic transmission fluid is the same fluid that they'll use in the power steering fluid. Automatic transmission fluid is hydraulic. It's hydraulically actuated transmission. Power steering systems are hydraulic. They will operate in the same manner. The kind of key note, though, to note with this, where it is very important, is if we have a Hydro Boost system. So if we have a system with without a vacuum brake booster, and I know this is kind of getting ahead, so you'll see these on a lot of diesels, they will have a Hydro Boost system where we have a hydraulic control unit that is going to not only give us power steering, but it will also give us braking assist. It is going to be important that we check the fluid level, because you will lose power steering and brake assist. So the vehicle will become extremely difficult to drive if that's the case. So we do want to make sure that the level is correct with that and we're using the right fluid. Now, brake fluid. Brake fluid is one of those that you're going to be going off of, looking at it, but not topping it off. It is important to understand, kind of, big disclaimer here, brake fluid is extremely caustic. It will remove car paint very easily. And if it removes car paint, it's really probably not good for your skin. So you want to make sure that you're using gloves when handling brake fluid. For the most part, brake fluid is going to be .3 or 4 on passenger vehicles. Performance vehicles will be .5, and power sports motorcycles will be 5.1. Now, the higher the dot rating, the higher the boiling point or the absorption point. Another test question you will see is brake fluid is hygroscopic. Hygroscopic meaning that it absorbs ambient moisture. So brake fluid over time will absorb air, and that will decrease the boiling point, which then you can get into a situation where the brake system will hydraulically fade, and that's where the brake fluid is boiling. Brakes are hydraulic. So as you press on the brake pedal, you're pushing hydraulic fluid through circuitry to push against the wheel cylinder and either the brake shoes or the brake pads to clamp against the rotor or the drum. That will slow the vehicle down. If you have the fluid boil because there's too much water in it, then you'll be compressing a gas, because gas is compressible it won't be actuating the brake pads against the rotor, and you won't slow the vehicle down at that point. So it's really important to be paying attention to the condition of our brake fluid and making sure that the brake fluid level is seen, but that the condition is mainly there. Now, we will have a min and max mark, and the fluid is going to be in between there. And depending on how much brake pad life we have is going to be dependent on how much fluid is or isn't in the reservoir. So as we start to lose brake fluid into the wheel cylinders because they're having to expand further out because our brake pads are getting thinner, the brake fluid reservoir will start to decrease in its volume, and that is 100% normal, and you do not need to top it off. If a brake system has a leak, you'll know it. It leaks it really quick, and you won't have any brake pedal. You usually get 2 to 3 pumps of the brake pedal before it goes and sinks to the floor, and then you'll know you have no fluid. So in the case of topping fluids off, brake fluid is the one that we're not going to be doing on a regular basis. We're going to be looking to see what the fluid level is, and if the fluid level is tracking towards the lower range, then we can see that, okay, that possibly means that we have brake pads that are a little bit worn or getting towards the end of their life, and we probably need to do a inspection of our brake pads. That way we can kind of have an idea with that. Some vehicles, so like my Gen 1 Toyota pickup truck, it actually would turn the brake level warning light on, and that was an indication that I needed to change the front pads out. So if we again look at our Mustang here. So our Mustang, our brake reservoir, because this is a left-hand drive vehicle, is going to be on the left-hand side of our dashboard, and this is our reservoir. And a reservoir, again, is going to be opaque and plastic, so it's going to be really tough to read. So what I like to do is I like to wipe it off, and again, we kind of shake it to see where the level is, and I can see my level is right about here. I have my max mark right there, and my minimum mark is right below this casting seam. So I can see that my level is pretty good. It is showing that it is right below the max, so that's going to be an indication that I have probably decent brake pads. Now, a lot of quick lane service places will top this off because they'll see it low, and I've had customers want it topped off. You don't consume brake fluid at all. The only time you might have a weird consumption thing is if the master cylinder leaks into the brake booster here, but that is pretty rare, and it will result in a spongy pedal. You don't want to top this off. Again, this brake fluid is very caustic and will damage the paint surrounding this strut tower and the firewall there. So if we overfill this, so if the brake pads are low and the level is down below here, we fill it up to the max mark. When we go to compress our pistons for our wheel cylinders to allow for the thicker pads, the new pads to go back in, that will then force this fluid out through the cap and spill all over in this area, and that will take all the paint off over here, and that will then result in the metal rusting. So we want to make sure that we're not overfilling these systems. The other thing we want to look for is the quality of the brake fluid. Now, brake fluid, as it starts to break down, it's very dark in color, and it becomes almost like it looks like there's dirt floating around in it. Now, I can see based off of the fluid that I have in there, it is extremely dark in color. This vehicle probably has not had the brake fluid serviced in a extremely long time. Typically, due to the fluid being hydroscopic, we'd want to change the brake fluid out about every 30,000 miles or 3 years, whichever comes first. And we'd want to do that at regular intervals to make sure that we don't have the system getting to where it can boil over if we get into a panic stop. So again, when we're looking at brake fluid, we're not going to be topping it off. We're just going to be checking the level, and that checking of the level might indicate that we do need to go through and service the brake pads if that's the case. On drum brake vehicles, it doesn't do that. The wheel cylinders don't expand out as the shoes wear out at that much of a rate. So it's not going to be something that we're going to really be terribly concerned with in terms of shoe life. But it will be the case for disc brake setups. So we want to make sure we are looking at that and we're paying attention to that and not having it get overfilled. Now, if we have a stick shift powered vehicle, we may have a hydraulic clutch and reservoir. So our Mustang that I keep showing you all, it has a cable actuated clutch. So we have no fluid in that. It has a cable very similar to like a bike shift cable. That does have an adjustment and everything that is a service interval, but that's not for the topic for what we're talking about today. If we have a hydraulic clutch system, though, we will have we may have a separate reservoir that will again have that .3 or .4 brake fluid in it, because it's going to operate off of the same manner. A lot of modern vehicles, though, that do have hydraulic systems, they will share reservoirs. So the brake master cylinder reservoir and the clutch master cylinder reservoir will be the same, one and the same, and they will be utilizing the same fluid. Again, service interval, you're going to be changing it at the same time you'll be changing the brake fluid every 3 years or 30,000 miles, whichever comes first, or if you're servicing a clutch. So if you're servicing a clutch, it's usually a good idea to bleed the hydraulic system so that it operates and functions well. Okay. Now, a fluid that used to kind of be a joke. It always used to be a joke with mechanics. Oh yeah, you got to go change the exhaust fluid out. Well, it's not a joke anymore. It actually exists, and it exists on ultra low emissions diesel vehicles. So you're going to see this on diesel vehicles starting in about 2012 and up. In 2007, we had a big emissions kind of crunch on diesels. And then also in 2012, we had a big change in diesel emission standards. So all modern diesel vehicles will have DEF urea fluid. Now, this is a fluid that is sprayed into the exhaust system via an injector on the selective recovery cat. So modern diesel emission systems, you'll have a typical EGR system, which is very similar to gasoline vehicles, PCV crankcase system, but the exhaust filters are very different. You will have a catalyst for carbon monoxide. At the very beginning, you'll have a particulate matter filter, so a soot filter, and then you will have a selective recovery filter to reduce nitrides of oxygen. This is typically the last of the three filters, so it's the last big component in the exhaust before we get to mufflers and such. The injector will be sprayed right before the catalyst material for the SCR, and it can range in how long and how many miles you can go. Usually a full tank of DEF or diesel exhaust fluid, which is anywhere between 4 to 6 gallons, will last 4,000 miles. And is typically filled at the same point as the filler point, and is always marked with a blue cap. So we can see the picture I have here of the filler caps. Ultra low sulfur diesel is green to kind of differentiate it from yellow for ethanol and black for gasoline. So the diesel cap will be green, and then we'll have a blue cap for our DEF. Now, diesel exhaust fluid is an interesting fluid in that it will break down very quickly with UV exposure. You can take a fresh, right off the assembly line bottle or a gallon of DEF, stick it out in the sun for about an hour, and it is absolutely worthless. So it is important to understand that if you do have a diesel vehicle, you need to make sure you're storing your extra DEF in a dark area away from UV exposure. When you look at the boxes that they come in, there's typically going to be a solid container, so not an opaque container, and it will come in a cardboard box, again, to try to avoid during shipping UV exposure. Diesel exhaust fluid is one of those things that we can't really check the level easily. Some diesel vehicles will have a gauge or function on the operator kind of area to where they can look and see what the fluid level is, and you just top it off. You just get a container and top it off as need be. Now, if you run the diesel exhaust system low, it won't affect how the vehicle runs in the terms of the vehicle operating system will run and drive just fine. However, the vehicles are programmed to shut off after a certain mileage if the DEF fluid goes low. And all of these modern diesel vehicles, they'll let you know well ahead of time. There's going to be warnings through the dash. Check engine lights often turn on, so on and so forth, to tell you, hey, fill up the DEF system, or you won't be able to start the vehicle the next stop. And I actually have a vehicle currently in my shop right now that's the case. They let the DEF system go too low, When you let it go too low for too long, it can corrode the system or crystalline up the system. The DEF fluid, when it is exposed to oxygen and UV, it goes to like a crystalline state. So it looks like almost kind of like sleeted snow, and it clogs up the system, and that's what happened to this. And the quality sensor inside of the tank failed, and I have to actually replace the entire tank on this particular truck. That they let the system go too low. It got towed in because they drove it to the maximum amount to where it was allowable, and the system basically shut itself off at that point. So I have to push the vehicle in and then replace the tank and fill it up. So again, make sure you're paying attention to that. Most diesel filling stops will also have DEF that you can purchase to fill up if that needs to be the case. Now, batteries. So batteries now are all maintenance free. Almost all of them. I can almost promise you, every single one of you that the vehicles you're driving, they're all maintenance free batteries at this point. So they don't need any service whatsoever. However, if you have a deep cycle battery in a RV, a boat, or an older vehicle, like an older 6-volt vehicle, you may have to add distilled water to the electrolyte mixture inside of the battery. And you need to do that again periodically, as the battery is in use, and it kind of depends on how often the vehicle is being used. Really, really important to always wear the appropriate PPE or personal protective equipment. So that's going to mean safety glasses, preferably goggles in case the battery explodes, and then also gloves. Wearing full gloves to prevent you from getting any acid on your skin, because when you open that up, it is very, very dangerous. This is something that kind of is no joke. My grandfather was a mechanic his whole life, and when he was 17, he was taken by the draft board right out of high school, didn't even get to graduate high school, and they sent him on a boat on an island in the middle of the Pacific during World War II. It's a little island called Tinian. Those of you that are history buffs, you kind of know the historical significance with that island, and he was there when all that stuff did happen. However, one of the things that he did have happen to him is while he was working on a 6-volt battery on a Jeep, the battery exploded, and he wasn't wearing safety glasses, and it went into his eyes, and he actually went temporarily blind. Conveniently, though, one of the doctors that was stationed on Tinian with him was a very, very well-renowned optician, and he figured out a treatment. Basically, they hung my grandfather upside down from his feet for 3 days and kept changing out bandages with lye in it to try to leach out the battery acid, and he was able to see again. So that was, he was able to regain his eyesight, which is, obviously very important. So we don't want to mess around with batteries, especially now that we're getting to systems that are a lot more under strain. Vehicles 12-volt systems are under far more strain than they used to be. Hybrid systems, those are going to be solid batteries. They're not going to have liquid electrolyte. It's going to be solid state or like gel style, either nickel metal hydride or a lithium polymer phosphate, whatever style battery it may have. So in those cases, it's not as big of a deal. There's other issues that you got to deal with, more electrocution side. But with 12-volt batteries, we do want to make sure we're being safe. Even if it is a maintenance-free battery, we talked about that there could be growth on the battery terminals, and that can be a result of a battery leak. That does mean that is acid getting out past the post in the terminal, and you do want to make sure you're wearing gloves and having proper safety glasses on as well. So the last thing to kind of conclude this is making sure that we're storing fluids correctly. A lot of these fluids do have a shelf life, and it is not as long as we'd like it to be. All of these fluids, too, again, are flammable. So it is very much important that we are storing all of these fluids in proper sealed metal containers, that if they do spontaneously combust, it will put itself out. When we're looking at fluid life, though, for the most part, engine oil, automatic transmission fluid, gear oil, power steering fluid, so all of that petroleum-based lubricants, they have a shelf life of about 2 years. So if you have a bunch of old oil in your garage and you don't know how old it is and it's got a big layer of dust on it, more than likely it's probably not any good anymore and it needs to be recycled properly. So you don't want to be storing that for too terribly long. Engine coolant, again, you're looking at it breaking down at the same rate if it's in an engine or if it's in a container, about 2 to 5 years. Brake fluid, however, so brake fluid, my suggestion to you is to always buy it in small containers, because once you pierce that little aluminum seal on the cap, the timer starts. Again, brake fluid being hygroscopic, it's really not that good to have it exposed. Brake fluid, personally for me, I don't use if it's been open for more than 6 months. If it's been open for more than 6 months, in my opinion, it's absorbed too much ambient water, and it's then no good at that point. And it becomes too corrosive and too likely to boil over during a panic stop. So at that point, you'd want to drain that and get rid of it. So I don't keep brake fluid around. I see a lot of people buy, like I had a student last semester, they were able to buy brake fluid in a gallon jug. And I was like, oh, dude, that's a waste. Buy it in the little pint containers and buy multiples of those. That's not necessarily something that, buying a big bulk container is going to save you money in the long run because you're going to be throwing a lot of it away. But again, make sure you're properly storing all of this stuff. Make sure you're properly storing the rags that you're checking with. Again, I know it sounds wasteful and it goes in a landfill, but if you throw the rag away, that's usually better off, or wash it immediately after, so that again it won't spontaneously combust.